The little boy's crayons were his world, a universe of wax and paper, spread across the chipped formica of the diner booth. His mother, Ilara, watched him from behind the counter, a soft smile playing on her lips as she wiped down the stainless steel surface. Her son, Leo, was a small sun, and she was a planet held in his gentle orbit. The man who had just stormed in was a black hole. His name was Miller, and he carried his bitterness like a loaded weapon. He slammed a heavy palm on the counter, making the salt and pepper shakers jump. The sound was a crack of thunder in the quiet afternoon lull of the diner. "Service!" he barked, the word not a request but a command, a whip-crack of entitlement. Ilara turned, her smile fading not into a frown, but into a mask of professional neutrality, a mask she wore often, too often. "What can I get for you, sir?" she asked, her voice as smooth and calm as the cream she poured into coffee. Miller's eyes, small and hard like pebbles, raked over her. They lingered on the slight fraying at the cuff of her uniform, the weariness in her posture that she tried so hard to hide. He saw weakness. He fed on it. He'd been an officer of the law once. He'd worn a badge that gave him power, and he'd used that power not to protect, but to crush. He'd been dismissed for brutality, a fact that festered inside him, turning his pride into a toxic poison he now spat at the world. He pointed a thick finger at Leo's booth. "Is that your kid?" Ilara's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, sir. My son, Leo." "This isn't a daycare," Miller sneered. "It's a place of business. Get him out of here." The few other patrons in the diner, an old couple sharing a slice of pie, a truck driver reading a newspaper, shifted uncomfortably. They looked down. They looked away. They did nothing. "He's not bothering anyone," Ilara said, her voice still quiet, but with a new spine of steel forged in a mother's fire. "He's just drawing." Miller laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Drawing. Right." He strode over to the booth, looming over the small boy. Leo shrank back, his bright, imaginative world suddenly under a dark and threatening shadow. On the table was a drawing, a knight in shining armor with a sword made of silver crayon, protecting a princess. It was a picture of courage, of goodness. Miller saw none of that. He saw only something small and fragile that he could break. He picked up Ilara's water glass from the table where she'd left it. He held it over the drawings. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. "Please," she whispered. The word was a tiny, desperate prayer. "Please don't." Miller's smirk was a gash in his face. It was a look of pure, unadulterated cruelty, the look of a man who enjoyed the sound of things breaking, especially hearts. He tilted the glass. Water cascaded down, a cold, clear flood that blurred the lines of wax, turning the brave knight into a swirl of muddy color. The silver sword bled into a gray mess. The princess's face dissolved into a formless blob. Leo let out a small, wounded gasp. It was the sound of a universe collapsing. He reached out, his small hands trying to shield his creations, to save what was already lost. "Hey!" Miller barked, and with a casual, thoughtless flick of his wrist, he shoved the boy's shoulder. It wasn't a hard shove. It didn't need to be. Leo, small and caught off balance, tumbled sideways off the vinyl bench, landing on the checkered linoleum floor with a soft thud. The room went absolutely silent. The clinking of cutlery stopped. The low murmur of conversation vanished. The sizzle from the grill seemed to die. All that was left was the sound of a little boy's quiet, hitching sob. And then another sound. A scrape. The sound of a simple wooden chair legs dragging against the floor. It was not a loud sound, but in the dead, suffocating silence, It was a gunshot. Every head turned. In the darkest corner of the diner, a man was standing up. He had been there for hours, a solitary figure nursing a single cup of black coffee, a ghost in the periphery. No one had paid him any mind. He was just a man. Tall, dressed in a simple black jacket, his dark hair threaded with premature silver at the temples. But as he rose to his full, imposing height, the very air in the room seemed to bend around him. It grew heavy. It grew cold. He was not just a man. The old cook, Sal, peered out from the kitchen pass-through, his face draining of all color. He made the sign of the cross, his hand trembling. He knew that face. It was a face from another lifetime, a face from the stories whispered in back rooms and dark alleys. The face of Marco the Ghost Verratti. Miller, drunk on his own petty power, hadn't felt the shift. He was still sneering down at the crying boy. That's when Leo, tears streaming down his face, pushed himself up. He didn't run to his mother. Instead, he looked at the tall, silent man rising from the corner. He saw the stillness in him, the absolute calm, the quiet strength. It was a strength he recognized, a strength he had been drawing all afternoon. Leo ran across the diner, his small sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. He ran right up to the most dangerous man in the city. He stopped just before him, looked up into those dark, haunted eyes and said, his voice trembling but clear, "Mom says you're the man from her dreams." Marco Verratti froze. His gaze, which had been locked on Miller with the cold focus of a predator, snapped to Alara. He saw her face, truly saw it for the first time in 8 years, the same dark hair as her sister, the same gentle eyes, the same quiet strength. And in that instant, a promise made on a deathbed, a vow sealed in grief, and guarded for years in silence and distance, shattered like glass. The ghost was back. And he was about to remind a bully what true fear felt like. All right, back to the story. The day had started with the smell of brewing coffee and the soft morning light filtering through the large plate glass windows of the Corner Cup. It was a simple place, an honest place. The vinyl on the booth seats was cracked in places, and the chrome trim on the counter was worn from decades of elbows leaning against it. But it was clean, and it was warm, and for Alara, it was a sanctuary. She moved with an economy of motion that was almost a dance, pouring coffee, flipping pancakes, sliding plates onto the pass-through window for Sal, the gruff but kind old cook, to fill. Her hands were never still, but her face was an island of calm. Leo was her anchor in the swirling currents of a life that had been anything but easy. He sat in his usual booth, the one in the back corner with the best view of the street, a box of 64 crayons his treasure chest. He was a quiet boy, an observer, with an artist's soul and his mother's gentle nature. He was drawing knights and dragons, castles and queens. His mother had filled his head with stories, not fairy tales of helpless princesses waiting for a prince, but stories of courage, of kindness, and of quiet heroes who did the right thing not for glory, but because it was the right thing to do. She told him stories about a man from her past, a man she called a hero, who was strong and sad and protected everyone he loved. She never used his name. He was just the man from her dreams, a mythical figure, a composite of all the goodness she wished for in the world. An idealized memory of her brother-in-law, Marco, a man she hadn't seen since the day her sister Lily was buried. Alara believed that man was gone forever, a part of a life she had escaped. She was raising Leo alone, on a waitress's wages, and it was hard. Every day was a struggle to make ends meet, to keep the weariness from her eyes, to ensure Leo's world remained as bright and colorful as his drawings. But she was proud. She asked for nothing. She endured. Her quiet dignity was her armor. Her kindness was her shield. To most, she was just a waitress, easily overlooked, easily dismissed. They did not see the immense resilience that held her together, the fierce, protective love that gave her purpose. They saw meekness, not strength. It was a common mistake. The morning rush had been busy. Truck drivers on their way out of the city, office workers grabbing a quick breakfast. Alara handled it all with her usual grace, a kind word for everyone, an extra splash of coffee for the regulars. The diner was a small community, and she was its quiet center. By early afternoon, the rush had subsided. Only a few tables remained. Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman who had been coming to the diner for 50 years, was reading her book. Two construction workers were finishing their lunch, talking in low tones. The atmosphere was peaceful. Then the bell above the door chimed, and the peace was broken. Miller walked in as if he owned the place. He wasn't a big man, but he projected an aura of belligerent size. His shoulders were thrown back, his chin was jutted out, and a permanent sneer seemed etched onto his lips. He was a man who walked through the world looking for a confrontation, itching for a reason to assert his dominance. He ignored the "please wait to be seated" sign and strode directly to the counter, throwing himself onto a stool with a loud scrape. Alara turned from the coffee machine. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice pleasant. "What can I get for you?" Miller didn't look at the menu. He looked at her, his eyes doing a slow, insulting appraisal. "Coffee, black." The words were clipped, dismissive. She poured a fresh cup into a thick ceramic mug and placed it on the counter in front of him. "Here you are." He took a sip and grimaced, slamming the mug back down. Coffee sloshed over the rim, pooling on the clean counter. "This is sludge. Is it that hard to make a decent cup of coffee?" "I just brewed it 5 minutes ago," Alara said calmly, grabbing a cloth. As she wiped up the spill, his eyes followed her hand. "Maybe you're the problem then," he said, his voice low and suggestive. "Can't even do a simple job right." Alara ignored the jibe. She had learned long ago that engaging with men like this was like throwing gasoline on a fire. The best response was no response. She simply straightened up and asked, "Would you like me to make a fresh pot?" Her unshakable calm seemed to infuriate him. He wanted a reaction. He wanted fear, anger, something to validate his power. Her quiet professionalism denied him that, so he escalated. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" he taunted. "Or are you just slow?" From the kitchen, Sal shot a dark look toward the counter. He knew Miller. The ex-cop had a reputation in the neighborhood, a walking storm cloud of resentment. Sal started polishing a heavy-bottomed pan, his knuckles white. Miller noticed Sal's glare and smirked, turning his attention back to Alara. He was enjoying this. He was the center of attention. He was in control. "I'll have the special," he finally said, tossing the menu onto the counter. "And make it quick. I don't have all day to wait for some single mom to get her act together." He deliberately glanced over at Leo, who was now looking up from his drawing, his eyes wide and uncertain. The boy had sensed the change in the room, the sour note in the air. Alara's jaw tightened. The mention of her son was a line crossed. But she held her composure. She wrote down the order and turned to clip it onto the wheel for Sal. "He's a quiet boy," she said, her back to Miller, her voice tight. "Yeah, well, the world's a loud place," Miller retorted. It eats quiet boys for breakfast. This was his philosophy, the creed of the bully. The strong devour the weak, the loud silence the quiet. He believed it because he had to. It was the only way to justify the ugliness inside him. He sat there, tapping his thick fingers on the counter, watching her every move. He found fault with everything. The way she refilled the sugar dispenser, the way she stacked the clean glasses. Each action was, in his eyes, a new failure, a new reason for his contempt. The other customers were now pointedly not looking. They were trapped in the awkward silence, hoping the problem would just go away. Their silence was a form of permission. It was the fertile ground in which bullies like Miller grew. This was the setup, the slow, methodical escalation. A man testing the boundaries of cruelty, and a woman enduring it with a dignity he could not comprehend and therefore had to destroy. And in the corner, unseen and unnoticed, another man watched. He saw the bully's preening arrogance. He saw the woman's quiet fortitude. He saw the boy's innocence. And he waited. Marco Verratti had made a promise to stay away, to let them live a normal life, untainted by the blood and shadows of his past. For 8 years, he had kept that promise. He watched from a distance, a guardian ghost, ensuring Alara had what she needed without her ever knowing he was there. An anonymous deposit into her account when rent was late. A quiet word with a landlord who was trying to evict her. Small, invisible acts of protection. Coming to the diner was a risk, a small breach of his own rules. He had heard from one of his contacts that she was struggling, that the hours were long. He just wanted to see for himself that she was okay. He had planned to sit for an hour, drink his coffee, and leave. His promise intact. But then Miller had walked in. And Marco Verratti, the man who had buried his heart with his wife and child, felt a cold, familiar anger begin to stir from its long slumber. The food arrived. Sal had cooked the steak perfectly. The eggs were fluffy, the hash browns golden and crisp. It was a perfect plate of food. Alara placed it in front of Miller. "Here is your special, sir." Miller stared at it for a long moment, then poked a piece of steak with his fork. He chewed it with exaggerated slowness, his face a mask of theatrical disgust. "This is garbage," he announced to the room. "It's overcooked, tough as shoe leather." Sal, who had been a short-order cook for 40 years and took immense pride in his work, stepped fully out of the kitchen. He was a short, stocky man with flour on his apron and decades of hard work etched into his face. "There is nothing wrong with that steak," Sal said, his voice a low rumble. Miller turned on the stool, a delighted smile spreading across his face. A new target. "Oh yeah? And who are you? The grease monkey back there?" "I'm the man who cooked your food," Sal said, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "And I'm telling you, it's a perfect medium rare, just like you didn't ask for because you were too busy running. Your mouth." The direct challenge took Miller by surprise. He was used to people cowering. He stood up, puffing out his chest to seem bigger than he was. "You got a problem, old man?" he snarled, stepping toward Sal. Alara quickly moved between them. "Please," she said, her hands up in a placating gesture. "There's no need for this. Sir, if you're not happy with the meal, it's on the house. You can just leave." She was trying to de-escalate, to protect Sal, to get this poison out of her diner. But to Miller, her intervention was a betrayal. She was taking the old man's side. She was defying him. His eyes narrowed into slits. The sneer on his face vanished, replaced by something colder, something uglier. The mask of the bully had slipped, revealing the sadist underneath. "On the house?" he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. You think you have the power to decide that? You're nothing. A nobody waitress in a dead-end diner with your brat. And that's when he turned his attention back to Leo's booth. He saw the drawings, the vibrant, hopeful little world on paper, and he decided, in that moment of pure malice, to destroy it. It was the perfect target. It was an extension of the boy, an extension of the mother. It was fragile and beautiful and innocent. He strode toward it, purpose in every step. This was the final straw. He grabbed the glass of water. Ilara's plea was a whisper lost in the roaring of his own ego. The water fell. The colors bled. The night died. Leo's small, heartbroken gasp was the only sound. The boy's instinct was to protect his art, his world. He reached out, and Miller shoved him. The shove was casual, dismissive, almost an afterthought. The act of a giant swatting a fly, but its effect was catastrophic. Leo tumbled to the floor, and the world stopped. The air in the corner cup solidified. It became a thick, unbreathable gel of shock and horror. Mrs. Gable's book slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud that sounded like a scream. The two construction workers were frozen, their forks halfway to their mouths. Sal stood rigid, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. Every person in that room was paralyzed by fear, by uncertainty, by the shame of their own inaction. They were a chorus of silent witnesses, their silence a condemnation of themselves. In the center of it all stood Ilara. She did not scream. She did not rush forward. She stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on her son, who was now on the floor, his small body curled up, his sobs quiet and muffled against the cold linoleum. Her face was pale, a canvas of shock and a pain so deep it was beyond tears. But through the shock, a fire was burning, a cold, hard, diamond-bright rage. It was the rage of a mother whose child had been harmed. It was a primal force, contained for now behind a dam of dignity, but it was there. She was a statue of grief and fury. Miller looked down at the boy, then around the room. He saw their frozen, horrified faces, and he smiled. This was power. This was control. He had shattered the peace. He had silenced the room. He had made a woman and a child helpless before him. He felt 10 feet tall. See, he said, his voice booming in the crushing silence. That's what happens. The world is a loud place. He had made his point. He had proven his philosophy. He was wrong. It began with the sound. A simple, mundane sound. The scrape of wooden chair legs against a worn floor. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But in the vacuum of that moment, it was an earthquake. Every eye in the room, which had been drawn to the drama at the center, now snapped to the source. The corner booth. The dark corner. The man was rising. He unfolded from the booth not quickly, but with a slow, deliberate grace that was far more terrifying than any sudden movement. He rose to his full, considerable height, and it felt as if he were drawing all the light and air in the room toward him. He was dressed simply. A well-worn black leather jacket over a plain gray shirt. Dark jeans. His hands were bare, but the sleeves of his jacket were pushed up slightly, revealing the edges of intricate, faded tattoos coiling around his forearms. Snakes and saints, thorns and scripture. A roadmap of a life lived in shadows. His face was the thing that held them captive. It was a study in stillness. His features were handsome in a severe, chiseled way, but it was his eyes that commanded the room. They were dark, watchful, and utterly calm. They held the weight of a history that no one in that diner wanted to know. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the worst of the world and had been a part of it. As he stood there, a palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere. It was a physical change, like a drop in barometric pressure before a hurricane. The fear that had been clinging to Alara and Leo, the fear that had paralyzed the other customers, did not vanish. It moved. It migrated across the room, a cold, invisible tide, and settled squarely on one person, Miller. The ex-cop was the last to notice. He was still basking in the glow of his petty victory. He saw the room looking past him and turned, an annoyed expression on his face. "What's everyone looking at?" Then he saw Marco. His first reaction was dismissal. Just some guy. Tall, maybe, but just another customer. Then his cop's instincts, dulled by arrogance but not entirely dead, kicked in. He registered the posture, the absolute lack of fear. The way the man stood, perfectly balanced, utterly relaxed, yet ready for anything. It was the posture of a predator. A cold finger of doubt, an emotion Miller hadn't felt in a long time, traced its way down his spine. The recognition came from the edges of the room first. Sal the cook let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Dio mio," he whispered, his face ashen. "It's him. The ghost." One of the construction workers, a man who had done some work on the docks in his youth, slowly put his fork down. His eyes were wide with a terrified respect. He had heard the stories. Everyone had. Marco Verratti wasn't just a gangster. He was a legend. A man who had brought the 5 warring families to the table and forged a peace that had lasted a decade. A man who had walked away from it all after a tragedy that had broken him. They said he was gone, retired, a ghost of the past. But the ghost was standing right there, and he did not look retired. The fear of the knowledgeable few spread to the ignorant many. The other customers didn't know who this man was, but they saw the reaction of those who did. They felt the change in the air. This was not just a man. This was an event. It was in this supercharged moment, with the room hanging on a precipice, that Leo acted. He pushed himself up from the floor, his face streaked with tears and dirt. He looked at his mother, standing frozen. He looked at the bully, sneering and confused. Then he looked at the tall, silent man, and he saw his knight. He saw the hero from his mother's stories, the sad, strong man who protected people. With the pure, unthinking faith of a child, he ran. His small feet carried him across the floor, straight toward the source of the new power in the room. He stopped a foot away from Marco, craning his neck to look up at the imposing figure. And he spoke the words that would change everything. "Mom says you're the man from her dreams." The words, spoken in a child's trembling, high-pitched voice, cut through the tension like a church bell. For a single, heart-stopping moment, Marco Verratti's mask of absolute calm cracked. His eyes, which had been fixed on Miller with a cold, impersonal fury, widened slightly. The focus of his universe, which had narrowed to a single point of retribution, shattered and reformed. His gaze left Miller. He looked down at the small, tear-streaked face of the boy, and then he looked up, across the room, at the boy's mother. He saw Ilara, not as a stranger, a victim he was about to defend, but as Ilara, Lily's little sister, the girl he had bounced on his knee 2 decades ago, the young woman who had stood beside him at his wedding, and then again at his wife's funeral, the last living piece of the family he had lost. He saw the 8 years of hardship she had tried to hide etched around her eyes. He saw the echo of her sister's strength in the set of her jaw. He froze. The air in his lungs turned to ice. The man from her dreams. the stories she told her son. It was him. An idealized, sanitized version of him. A memory she had polished into a fairy tale for her child. And in that instant, his carefully constructed peace, his 8 years of silent penance, his promise to stay away and keep her safe from his world, all of it turned to ash. Because his world had just come crashing into hers. His failure was absolute. He had tried to protect her with distance, but distance had left her vulnerable. A new resolve, harder and colder than anything he had felt in years, settled over him. The promise was broken. A new one had to be made. His gaze now holding a universe of grief and regret, and a terrifying, newly awakened purpose, moved from Alara and settled back on Miller. The cold finger of doubt on Miller's spine had become an icy hand gripping his heart. He saw the look in the tall man's eyes and knew, with a sudden, sickening certainty, that he had made a mistake of catastrophic proportions. Marco took one slow step forward. He gently placed a large calloused hand on Leo's small shoulder, a gesture of both protection and possession. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud. It was a low, quiet rumble, but it carried through the dead, silent room with the weight of granite. It was the voice of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Step away from her. It was not a request. It was not a warning. It was a command. And it was the sound of Miller's world beginning to end. To understand what happened next, you need to know who Marco Verratti was. You need to understand the man they called the Ghost. The name wasn't because he was quiet, though he was. It was because he had a habit of making problems and people disappear without a trace, without a sound, without a whisper of violence. One day there was a threat, a rival, a war brewing. The next there was only peace, and a void where the problem used to be. He had inherited a fractured empire from his father, a city torn apart by 5 warring crime families. The old ways were loud and bloody. Car bombs, public executions, a constant cycle of vengeance. Marco saw the waste in it, the inefficiency, the lack of control. He didn't rule with fear, not in the traditional sense. He ruled with loyalty. He understood that true power wasn't the ability to destroy your enemies, but the ability to turn them into allies or to make them irrelevant. He built his organization on a strict code of honor. You protected your own. You did not harm innocents. You did not bring chaos to the streets where ordinary people lived. Business was business, but there were lines. Lines Marco enforced with chilling finality. His lieutenants were not thugs. They were intelligent, disciplined men who understood his philosophy. They were fiercely loyal because he had earned it. He had taken them from broken homes, from dead-end lives, and given them purpose, structure, and a code. He was more than a boss. He was a mentor, a patriarch. But the center of his world, the sun around which his dark galaxy orbited, was his family, his wife, Lily, and their daughter, Sophia. Lily was his opposite. Where he was quiet and calculating, she was vibrant and full of laughter. She was the light that chased the shadows from his soul. She knew who he was, what he did, but she saw the good man buried beneath the reputation. She was his conscience, his humanity. Sophia was their world. A little girl with her mother's laugh and her father's watchful eyes. For her, he was just Papa, the man who read her stories and fixed her broken toys. He had been trying to get out. For them, he had been slowly, carefully converting his assets, legitimizing his businesses, building a bridge from the darkness into the light. He was almost there. Then came the betrayal. It came from his most trusted captain, a man he had treated like a brother, a man who grew jealous of Marco's power and saw weakness in his desire for a peaceful life. He made a deal with an outside faction, a rival from another city looking to move in. The plan was simple: a car bomb, meant for Marco. But that day, Marco had been delayed in a meeting. Lily had decided to take Sophia for ice cream, a spontaneous trip, a small, happy moment in a normal afternoon. They were in his car. Marco heard the explosion from his office window 5 blocks away. He ran. He ran through the screaming streets, pushing past the crowds and the first responders. He knew before he saw it. The fire, the twisted metal, the smell. That was the day Marco Verratti died. The man who loved and laughed and dreamed of a life in the sun was incinerated in that blast along with his wife and daughter. What was left was the ghost. He did not go on a rampage. He did not start a war. That would have been too easy, too loud. That was the old way. Instead, he became what his name suggested. He moved through his old world with a cold, silent precision. The rival faction from out of town? They vanished. Their leaders were found a month later, not dead, but broken, penniless, their empires dismantled through a series of surgical, financial, and legal attacks Marco orchestrated from the shadows. His treacherous captain? He was not killed. Marco found him, cornered him, and took everything from him. His money, his power, his family, who Marco had spirited away to safety, leaving the captain utterly alone. He left him alive, but with nothing, a ghost in his own life, haunted by what he had lost. It was a punishment far more profound than a bullet. And then, Marco himself vanished. He dismantled his own organization, handing over the legitimate businesses to his most loyal lieutenants. He kept only a fraction of his wealth, enough to live on, and a network of information. He walked away from it all. At Lily's funeral, he had stood beside her younger sister, Ilara. She was just a teenager then, shattered by the loss of her only family. He had held her hand, his own grief a black hole that swallowed all sound. Before he disappeared, he made a promise, a silent vow to Lily's memory. He would watch over her sister. He would be her unseen guardian, but he would do it from a distance. He believed his presence, his very existence, was a poison. He would not let his darkness touch her. He wanted her to have the one thing he never could, a normal, peaceful life. For 8 years, he kept that vow. He lived in a small, anonymous apartment across the city. He followed her life through intermediaries. He knew when she got a job at the diner. He knew when Leo was born. He knew the father had been a mistake, a man who had left as soon as he found out she was pregnant. He knew how hard she worked, how much she struggled. He had sent her money, anonymously. He had dealt with a slumlord who tried to take advantage of her. He had been the invisible shield she never knew she had. The stories she told Leo, the man from her dreams, were a shock. It meant that on some level, she remembered the man he had been, not the monster he had become. She had turned his dark past into the child's fable of heroism, and now, this loud, pathetic bully had kicked down the door of her sanctuary. He had put his hands on her child. He had brought the ugliness of the world to the one person Marco had sworn to protect from it. The promise of distance was a failure. The pact for peace was void. As he stood there, his hand on Leo's shoulder, looking at the terrified face of the ex-cop, Marco Verratti was no longer a ghost. He was a resurrection. And the bill for Miller's cruelty had just come due. The deconstruction began not with a fist, but with a question. Marco took another slow step forward, guiding Leo gently behind him. The boy clung to the back of Marco's leather jacket, peering out from behind the safety of this sudden, absolute protector. Marco's eyes never left Miller. "What is your name?" he asked. The question was quiet, almost conversational, but it landed in the silent room like a block of granite. Miller, his bravado evaporating under that intense, unblinking stare, stammered, "Miller, Frank Miller." "Frank Miller," Marco repeated, tasting the name, filing it away. "Tell me, Frank Miller, why are you here?" I was just getting lunch," Miller stuttered, his gaze darting around the room, looking for an escape route, an ally. He found none. Every face was turned toward him, but they were no longer just witnesses. They were a jury. "No," Marco said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a confidential, chilling murmur that only Miller could hear. "That's what you were doing. I asked you why you are here, in this moment, standing over a child on the floor, a child you pushed." Miller's face, which had been pale with fear, now flushed with a defensive anger. "The kid got in my way. He needed to learn a lesson. The world isn't a nice place." "The world isn't a nice place," Marco echoed softly. "You believe that, don't you? You believe the world is hard and cruel, so it's your right, your duty, even, to be hard and cruel right back." "You have to be strong," Miller insisted, trying to regain some footing. "You can't let people walk all over you." "Is that what she was doing?" Marco asked, his head tilting just slightly. "Was this woman walking all over you? Was this child a threat to you?" He gestured with his chin toward Alara, who was now slowly walking toward them, her eyes fixed on her son. She had an attitude," Miller said, the excuse sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "No," Marco corrected him gently. "She had dignity. You saw her quiet strength, and you mistook it for weakness. You saw his innocence, and you mistook it for fragility. It offended you. Her ability to endure without breaking. His ability to create without asking for anything. It was a light you couldn't stand, so you had to try and put it out." Each word was a precise surgical cut, laying bare the pathetic truth of Miller's character. This wasn't a physical beatdown. It was a vivisection of a man's soul, performed in public. "You were a cop, weren't you, Frank?" Marco asked, his tone unchanged. Miller's eyes widened in shock. How did you know that?" "I know the look," Marco said. "The look of a man who was given a little bit of power and let it rot him from the inside out. They gave you a badge and a gun to protect people like her. And people like him." He nodded again toward Alara and Leo. "But you used it to bully, to intimidate, until they took it away from you. And now you have nothing left but that rotten feeling inside you. So you walk into a place like this, and you try to feel big by making a woman and a child feel small." He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. The silence in the room was absolute, reverent. Everyone was leaning in, listening to this quiet, devastating indictment. "Tell me, Frank," Marco said, his voice now laced with a thread of genuine curiosity. "Does it work? Do you feel big right now? Do you feel strong?" Miller said nothing. He couldn't. He was stripped bare. His arrogance, his excuses, his entire worldview had been dismantled and laid out for all to see. He was just a sad, angry man in a diner, exposed as a coward. Marco then did something unexpected. He turned away from Miller. He turned to face the rest of the diner. His gaze swept over the customers, the jury, Mrs. Gable, the construction workers, the other silent faces. "You were all here," he said, his voice returning to a normal volume, but still carrying that immense authority. You saw what happened. He looked at Mrs. Gable. Ma'am, what did you see? The elderly woman, who had been frozen in fear, found her voice. It was shaky, but firm. I saw that man, she said, pointing a trembling finger at Miller. Bully that poor girl from the moment he walked in. And then he hurt the boy. For no reason. For cruelty's sake. Marco nodded. He looked at the two construction workers. And you? The bigger of the two, the one who had recognized Marco, stood up. We saw it all. He was a loudmouth looking for trouble. What he did to the kid, it was wrong. We should have done something. The admission was heavy with shame. Yes, Marco said, without judgment. You should have. He turned his gaze to Sal, who was now standing with his arms crossed, a heavy meat tenderizer hanging from his hand, forgotten. Sal, Marco said, you know this neighborhood better than anyone. Is this the kind of man we want in our community? Sal shook his head, his expression grim. No, Marco. He is poison. He preys on the good. This was the trial. Swift, public, and absolute. The verdict was unanimous. Finally, Marco turned back to Miller, who seemed to have shrunk. The air of menace around him completely gone, replaced by a desperate, pathetic fear. But Marco did not look at him. He looked at Alara, who had now reached him, her hand reaching out to touch Leo's hair. Ilara, Marco said, and the use of her name was both an apology and a promise. His voice was softer now, laced with a deep, ancient sorrow. I am sorry. I am sorry I let this happen. She looked up at him, her eyes full of questions, but also a dawning recognition. The man from her stories was real, and he was here. What he did, it was not just to us, she said, her voice finding its strength. It was to everyone. The fear he creates. It's the problem. Marco held her gaze. He saw the steel in her, the same steel Lily had. He gave her the ultimate power in that room, the power of justice. What do you want me to do, Ilara? He asked. Tell me what you want. The entire room held its breath. This was it. The moment of sentencing. They expected a call for violence, for blood. The man was Marco Verratti, after all. A ghost from a world of brutal retribution. Miller's face was a mess of terror. He was picturing a back alley, a shallow grave. He started to babble. Please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean. I can pay for the damage. Please. Ilara looked at the sniveling, broken man. She felt no pity, only a cold clarity. Violence would be too easy. It would make him a victim. It would be an end, not a lesson. She looked back at Marco. I don't want you to hurt him, she said, and a wave of confusion rippled through the room. Hurting him won't fix anything. It won't unspill the water. It won't take the fear out of my son's eyes. She took a deep breath, her voice clear and unwavering, ringing with a newfound authority. I want him to understand, she said. I want him to spend every day looking into the faces of people like me, people like my son, people whose lives have been shattered by bullies like him. I don't want his pain. I want his education. It was a sentence of profound and devastating wisdom. A slow smile touched Marco's lips. It was not a happy smile. It was a smile of deep, resonant pride. She was Lily's sister, through and through. He had his orders. He nodded once. A fitting sentence. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on two men who had been sitting at a small table by the door, unnoticed until this very moment. They were dressed in simple work clothes, but like Marco, they possessed a stillness, a coiled readiness. They were two of his old lieutenants, men who had chosen to remain loyal to him even in his retirement, managing his legitimate enterprises and acting as his eyes and ears. They had been his silent backup, just in case. They met his gaze and stood up in unison. Their movements were fluid, economical. They were professionals. They were the enforcers. They walked toward Miller, one on each side. They didn't grab him. They didn't touch him. They simply stood there, their presence a cage of inescapable consequence. Miller looked from one man to the other, his eyes wild with panic. What's happening? Where are you taking me? Marco stepped forward until he was inches from Miller's face. He spoke again in that chilling, confidential whisper. "You're going to get an education, Frank," he said. "I own a number of charitable foundations. One of them is a shelter downtown, a place for battered women and abused children. It's called Lily's House." The name hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken tragedy. "You're going to be their new janitor," Marco continued. "You will mop the floors. You will scrub the toilets. You will clean up the messes left by broken lives. And every day, as part of your duties, you will sit in on the group therapy sessions. You will not speak. You will listen. You will listen to the stories of women who have been beaten. You will listen to the stories of children who have been terrorized. You will listen to the consequences of the philosophy you hold so dear." Miller's face was a mask of horror. This was a fate worse than any beating. It was a sentence of forced empathy, a prison of the conscience. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I'll quit. I'll run." "No, you won't," Marco said calmly, "because these two gentlemen will be your supervisors. And if you try to leave, if you are disrespectful in any way, if you fail to listen with anything but absolute attention, they will take you somewhere else, a place with no stories, no light, no sound. A place where you will have a very long time to think about your mistakes in complete and total silence. Do you understand me?" The threat was unspoken, but absolute. The promise of a ghost making someone disappear. Miller understood. The terror in his eyes was complete. He nodded jerkily, unable to speak. "Good," Marco said. He stepped back. The two lieutenants each placed a light, firm hand on Miller's arms. "Time to go, Frank," one of them said, his voice devoid of all emotion. They turned and walked him toward the door. Miller moved like a man in a trance, his legs unsteady. As he passed the counter, he glanced at the plate of food he had scorned, the perfect steak, the golden hash browns, the last good meal he would have for a very long time. They opened the door, and the three of them stepped out into the afternoon light and were gone. The bell above the door chimed softly, signaling their exit. And then there was peace. The silence that followed was different. The fear was gone, replaced by a stunned, fragile calm. It was the quiet after a storm has passed, leaving the air clean and charged. Life resumed in slow motion. Mrs. Gable bent down and picked up her book, her hands no longer trembling. The construction workers exchanged a look of profound awe and slowly returned to their cold lunch. Alara knelt and gathered her son into her arms, holding him tight. Leo buried his face in her shoulder, the scent of her uniform, of coffee and safety, filling his senses. He was okay. His night had come. Marco stood for a moment watching them. The anger had receded, leaving behind the familiar ache of his grief, but it was now mingled with something new, a sense of purpose rekindled. Sal emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He walked over to the booth where Marco had been sitting and began clearing the single cold coffee cup. He looked up at Marco, his eyes full of a deep, weary wisdom. "You did the right thing, Marco," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Some men, they get a taste of power and they forget what it's for. They think strength is about how loud you can shout, how hard you can push. They forget. Forget what, Sal? Marco asked, his voice tired. That real strength, Sal said, gesturing with the coffee cup toward Alara and Leo, is about this. It's about protecting what's good, what's quiet. It's about being the wall that the storm breaks against. Sal's words were a validation, an absolution from the community itself. He had broken his pact of peace, but he had done it to restore a more important peace. He had not brought violence, but justice. Marco walked over to Alara. He knelt so he was at eye level with her and Leo. He won't bother you again, he said. It was an absolute statement, a fact of the new world he had just created. Alara looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time as a man, not a myth. She saw the lines of sorrow around his eyes, the immense weight he carried. He was older, harder, but she could still see the man who had been married to her sister. Why? She asked, the question holding a dozen others. Why were you here? Why did you help? Why did you stay away for so long? I made a promise to Lily, he said, his voice thick with emotion, that I would watch over you. I thought keeping my distance was the best way. I thought my world would poison yours. I was wrong. My absence left you unprotected. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed a stray crayon smudge from Leo's cheek. Kindness is not a weakness, Alara, he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. It is the only real strength there is. The world is full of loud, angry men like him. They thrive in silence. They feed on the fear of good people who look away. They only lose when someone stands up and says no more. He looked at Leo, who was now peering at him with wide, curious eyes, the fear replaced by awe. You were very brave, Marco told the boy. You have a good mother. She teaches you about the right things, about knights. Alara finally let the tears she had been holding back fall. They weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief, of release. The heavy weight of doing it all alone, of being constantly vigilant, had been lifted. I told him stories, she whispered, about a hero. I never thought he was real. He wasn't, Marco said, a flicker of the old pain in his eyes. That man died a long time ago, but he would have been proud of you, and of your son. He stood up. The moment of intimacy was over. He was once again a figure of authority, of power. He walked to the counter and pulled a thick roll of cash from his jacket pocket. He peeled off several $100 bills and laid them on the counter. This is for the damages, he said to Sal, and for the trouble. Sal just shook his head. No need, Marco. This was good for the neighborhood. Marco pushed the money forward anyway. For her, he said, nodding toward Alara. For a new box of crayons, the biggest one they make. He turned to leave. His work was done. Justice had been served. Wait, Alara said, standing up. Leo held her hand. Will we see you again? Marco paused at the door, his back to her. For a moment he considered disappearing again, becoming a ghost once more, his duty fulfilled. But he looked at the memory of her face, so much like Lily's, and the feel of the small boy's trust, and he knew that was no longer an option. I'm not going anywhere, he said without turning around. I'll be close. And with that, he was gone. 3 months later, the sign above the corner cup came down. A new one went up, painted in a soft, elegant script. It read, Lily's Place. Inside, the diner was transformed. The cracked vinyl on the booths had been replaced with plush, dark red upholstery. The chipped Formica tabletops were now polished wood. The lighting was warmer. the atmosphere brighter. But it still felt like the same place, its heart and soul intact, just cared for. Ilara was no longer a waitress. She was the owner. Marco had approached her a week after the incident, not with a gift, but with a business proposal. He presented it as an investment, a way for him to legitimize more of his old money. He laid out a plan for her to buy the diner from Sal, who was more than ready to retire. He would back her, but she would run it. It would be hers. She had been hesitant at first, afraid of the strings that might be attached. But he had been clear. This isn't a handout, Ilara. It's a partnership. Lily always wanted to open a place like this, a place where people felt safe and welcome. You can build that. For her. For Leo. And so she had. She moved with a new confidence now. The weariness was gone from her eyes, replaced by a bright spark of purpose. She greeted her customers, her community, with a wide, genuine smile. She was still kind, still gentle, but no one would ever mistake her kindness for weakness again. The entire neighborhood knew her story. They knew who her silent partner was. They treated her with a profound respect. She was protected. Leo had his own permanent booth now, a large one in the back, laden with art supplies of every kind. His drawings covered a dedicated corkboard wall, a gallery of knights and smiling queens, of sunny days and safe castles. He was a happy, thriving boy, secure in the knowledge that his world was safe. Sometimes a tall, quiet man in a black leather jacket would come in and sit in the corner booth. He would order a black coffee and watch the life in the diner, a small, sad smile on his lips. Ilara would bring him his coffee, and they would talk for a few minutes. About the business, about Leo's school, about the weather. Normal things. They were family, piecing together a new definition of the word from the fragments of their shared past. And what of Frank Miller? His epilogue was quieter, but no less profound. He was, as promised, the new janitor at Lily's house. His life was a monotonous cycle of bleach and dirty water, of scrubbing floors and cleaning up the messes left by pain. He looked older, smaller, haunted. Every afternoon at 4 o'clock, he would take his place on a plastic chair in the back of a brightly lit room, and he would listen. He listened to a young woman describe how her husband's angry words were like stones, chipping away at her until she felt like nothing. He listened to a child's therapist explain why a little boy was drawing pictures of monsters hiding under his bed. He listened to story after story of casual cruelty, of petty tyranny, of bullies who used their fists and their words to feel powerful. He listened to his own biography, told in 100 different voices. He never spoke. He just listened, under the watchful, silent gaze of one of Marco's men, who sat by the door, reading a newspaper. There was no escape. He was serving his sentence, an education in empathy, a long, slow, agonizing lesson in what it truly meant to be small. His cruelty had not been met with cruelty. It had been met with consequence. His darkness was not answered with more darkness, but with a forced, unrelenting exposure to the light. It was a justice that was quiet, methodical, and absolute. Back at Lily's place, the late afternoon sun streamed through the clean windows. Ilara laughed at something a customer said. Leo showed his mother a new drawing, a picture of a big family sitting around a table in a warm, bright diner. In the drawing, a little boy, a woman, and a tall, sad-eyed man with a kind smile were all holding hands. True strength wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about creating a space where the quietest voices could finally be heard. It wasn't about breaking things. It was about building something that could never be broken again.